Hey teacher, leave them kids alone. Learning is too important to be left to humans. Time to hand it over to the machines. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Hellman.
Now guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
B.F. Skinner is a much vilified figure in learning circles. The strain of radical behaviourism that he espoused, often characterised as reductive, mechanistic and inhumane, was denounced and overturned within his own lifetime. Chomsky said it wasn't real science. And from the 1970s onwards, psychology took a very different route. But that's not to say that Skinner's ideas didn't have an influence on the subsequent development of training and education. They had a huge influence. My guest this time on The Learning Hack has written a book called Teaching Machines about the efforts of Skinner and others in the pre-computer era to systematise and automate learning. Her name is Audrey Watters. She says Skinner's influence is still with us, and she believes it's highly pernicious. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact, give us her biog.
Hack facts.
Audrey Watters describes herself as an education writer, an independent scholar, a serial dropout, a rabble-rouser, and EdTech's Cassandra. Her writing appears in a wide range of outlets, including The Atlantic, Vice, O'Reilly Radar, and The Huffington Post. And she was a Spencer Education Journalism Fellow at Columbia University's Journalism School. Teaching Machines, out on 3rd of August 2021, is her first book.
Thanks, Kate. So, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. What do we learn from this story of teaching machines?
There was a strong theme of personalising learning throughout the discussion, John, or individualising it, as they said last century. And it should make sense to let kids progress at their own speed, shouldn't it? Every teacher knows that mixed ability teaching is a nightmare. Personalising learning with technology is common in organisations now for adults, but somehow it's never really caught on in schools. Drilling into the question of why exactly that should be makes this a really fascinating discussion to end the season on.
Excuse me.
Yes, you heard right. This is the last episode of the current season, and yes, it's a good one. Audrey sounds a succession of warning notes in our chat about the slightly hard to explain persistence of Skinner's influence on learning technologies and the frightening future we might be sleepwalking towards as a result. She's a controversial voice. You might not agree with everything she says, but what she has to say is really worth listening to. Welcome to The Learning Hack, Audrey Watters. Your book, Teaching Machines, tells the fascinating story of part of the history of learning tech that most of us probably think we know about, but actually don't. And I want to start in the place that you start, more or less, and that's with B.F. Skinner. So what do we all know about B.F. Skinner? He kept his daughter in a box, is the father of a reductive mechanistic school in psychology known as behaviourism, and he invented the teaching machine. I think that probably sums up the popular view. But Audrey Watters, which, if any of those things, is true?
There is a kernel of truth to all of those things, of course. As most of the time when someone like Skinner is known, outside of his field, right, outside of academia, we do have sort of a quick sketch about what he was like, and those things are partially true. But I think actually Skinner is a much more fascinating, much more, in some ways, horrifying character, and certainly for the field of education and the field of education technology, probably, sadly, one of the most important figures in the field, and whose influence I think we still experience today, partly through that very mechanistic notion of behaviorism.
So why do you say sadly?
Exactly. I tried very hard in the book, I should say, not to make Skinner into the villain, because I'm not a fan of behaviorism. I should put an asterisk there, and I'll come back to that in a minute. I'm not really a fan of a lot of what of Skinner's ideas about how people should learn, his application of his learning theories from animals to humans, but in particular, the ways in which I think he extrapolated his theories to ideas about engineering society and his belief that freedom was not real and that really we should sort of just hand ourselves over to scientists to have our lives carefully engineered.
I read a book about to tell people that freedom, autonomy were kind of myths, and it is slightly chilling, isn't it? But tell us about the teaching machines and what he did with teaching machines.
So it's really, I think, if Skinner were alive today, he would definitely be the kind of person who would be asked to do a TED Talk. And his TED Talk would certainly start with this anecdote that's repeated many times, in which he visited his daughter's fourth grade classroom. And he noticed that the teacher was standing at the front of the classroom instructing them on math, and the students had work to do, an assignment to do. And he just noticed the way in which some students were able to move through it very quickly, complete all the assignment, and then they were kind of bored. And some students were frustrated and not able to do the assignment. And the teacher kind of wandered up and down the desks and intervened where she could. But then at the end of the class period, 45 minutes for math, she gathered their papers and would take them home and to grade them and then give them back the next day. And this, of course, all of this, Skinner said, ran counter to his ideas, behaviorism, his ideas about teaching and training, which included the idea that you needed immediate reinforcement. So getting your paper back the next day, whether it had a good marks or bad marks on it, wasn't enough of a sufficient reinforcement for you to learn. So you needed immediate reinforcement and you needed positive reinforcement. Of course, Skinner perfected this most famously by working with pigeons, getting pigeons to play the piano, play ping pong, by giving them food when they successfully completed the trick. And so his idea was to not give children pellets of food per se, but to offer immediate positive reinforcement and train them in a certain direction. And so he thought, well, the teacher isn't doing this, so I think a machine would do this. And so he went home and he built a little prototype of a wooden box that would offer the student a question, give the student a question, and if the student completed the question correctly, they would get to move on to the next question. And he eventually tried to take this to market, to turn this into a commodity. And really, that's the story of the book. In part, is how he was not able to how Skinner was not able to commercialize the teaching machine that he invented.
Yeah, a lot of the book is taken up with his horrendous struggles to try and get the machine into production and the back and forth with various companies, including IBM and so on. But before B.F. Skinner went this route, there had been a precursor, hadn't there? There was another, Sidney Pressey, who seemed to have a similar experience. Can you tell us a little about him and his teaching machine?
Bless Sidney Pressey's heart. I did a lot of research in archives for the book, going through the papers that were at Ohio State University for Sidney Pressey and at Harvard for B.F. Skinner. And both men were prolific scholars in their fields of educational psychology, but also really prolific letter writers. And so there were a lot of correspondence that I could read, and much of it, pages and boxes and boxes of letters of them both struggling to take these machines that they'd invented and commercialize them. Sidney Pressey, Skinner's work happened around the same time as Sputnik in the US. And so Sputnik is really seen as this moment in US that that the country decided to really double down on science education and also double down on technologies of education. So Skinner's timing was pretty good.
Yeah.
Sidney Pressey, of course, was working in the late 1920s and ran into this little bump in the road called the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So he was just up against, I think, a lot of other circumstances. But Pressey also, like Skinner, recognized that machines might be the way in which we could automate education. And strangely, I think it's counterintuitive in some ways when I say this, both men and a lot of men in the 20th century, and they were almost entirely men, believed that if we could automate education, then we can personalize education or individualize education. And that's what Sidney Pressey absolutely believed. But he too, these two academics both really struggled when they came face to face with corporations that were initially interested in manufacturing their device.
So yes, they both had a lot of problems getting their inventions into production. Why do you think it was so hard?
So I think that there are lots of interesting things and interesting parallels for today too. I mean, I didn't want the book to be so pedantic that every couple of pages I had to say to the reader, and this is almost exactly what we experience today. But I think there is a lot of struggle between science and what academics in particular are doing with science and what commercial interests have in mind. And I think that both Pressey and Skinner, but in particular B.F. Skinner, who I think is known for being so vehemently opposed to any other psychological ideas other than his own. Even other people's versions of behaviorism were a little suspect. I think that they were both rather inflexible when it came to taking their ideas, not just the machines and the designs for the machines, but their ideas and letting those enter the marketplace. I think that they had a very strict idea of what good science looks like, and the companies that they were working with didn't really give a damn about good science. They wanted a machine that was going to make money when they sold it. I think that that's probably a lot of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it a couple of ways. You can think it's the kind of inflexibility of Skinner and to a degree Pressey as well. Academia bumping up against business and the two not really getting on. In the post-computer era, we see things happening a lot. You know, the internet was invented in academic context and had less problem getting going. We've seen a lot of spin-offs from academia. And a way that you could look at the Skinner and Pressey thing is that because it was pre-computer, basically you had to build a mechanical object which you could only use for that thing. And there were problems with typewriter companies, weren't there? With Sidney Pressey that Sidney Pressey went to. Whereas once you had the computer around, you had a platform that you could do numerous things with it. So it's kind of less risky to try out doing this other stuff on it. And the economics of the thing meant that actually you kept seeing the companies doing the sums and saying, this is never going to kind of, you know, the wages of a teacher teaching 40 kids as opposed to 40 machines, each costing quite a lot of money, just didn't pan out. Which side will you come down there, economics or academic inflexibility?
Well, I think that the other piece too, and I'm glad that you brought up the rise of computers, because I mean, I think we do see in computing, we have the hardware and we have the software. And I think that, some of the things that were successful out of the teaching machine movement were, I think, the equivalent of the software. Which would have been the kind of programmed instruction, the kinds of programs that would work on the machines. Of course, one of the problems with the teaching machines is they weren't standardized, even the way in which sort of computers are standardized today, where you have software works most of the time on on Windows or Mac operating system, for example. So it's not entirely dependent on the hardware. But the publishers were also very interested in the teaching machines, not just the manufacturers, but educational publishers. And they too struggled with, do we make the programs that work with these teaching machines, do we just have them built so that they work only on, for example, the machines that a company called TMI, Teaching Machines Incorporated, make, or do we make them so that they just work on the IBM machine? And so there was a lot of, even the equivalent of the software was very tightly bound to the machines. And so I think that one of the things that I think makes education technology a lot easier to develop now is that you don't really, if you're building ed tech, you don't have to worry as much about the machinery. You can just focus on the software. Where, of course, Skinner and Pressey were both obsessed with the hardware, obsessed with getting the machine right, but then they were also up to their necks in making sure that the software was, that the programs were correct in their minds as well. And I mean, and really Skinner was very particular. He believed that Sidney Pressey's machine, for example, was flawed. Had flawed. He had students who developed machines. He didn't like their machines either. So he was very particular about what he wanted things to look like.
It would probably be hard to find an example of something that somebody else other than Skinner had done or designed in terms of teaching machine software or hardware that he actually had a good word for. I mean, it wasn't it very much, Skinner knows best and nobody else does.
I think that this is Skinner's personality absolutely in a nutshell. I mean, and I think that he was such a commanding figure. I think that I'm not sure who the equivalent would be today, but Skinner was certainly probably one of the best known public intellectuals in American life. He wasn't just a professor of psychology that maybe some people knew about. This was a guy who would be on the cover of Time magazine. He appeared on, those nightly talk shows like on Dick Cavett show and things like that. He was a name that people would have known about, that average folks would have known about, and had a loose understanding, I think, about some of his ideas. So he was really a powerful, commanding intellectual in American life in the late 20th century, or mid to late 20th century.
What I find extraordinary about him is that he did things which were incredibly newsworthy, like trying to bring a baby up in a steel box, researching with pigeons, and then trying to apply that to school children. All this stuff, you could imagine journalists going straight for it. But there's no kind of P.T. Barnum sense here that he had an awareness of that. It's not like he would now be a kind of Instagram bunny or whatever. He didn't seem to have a kind of marketing bone in his body. And it was entirely inadvertent. Am I over-egging that? Or, is it in the sense that he just totally didn't get why people thought this stuff was so headline-worthy?
He wrote long before he developed his teaching machine. He and his wife, when they had their second child, in fact, it was when his daughter was in fourth grade that he visited her classroom. But when she was born, he decided that he wanted to, he called it gadgetize her child rearing. And this is post-war America, and you can think that it very much is goes along with a lot of ideas that were popular.
You have washing machines and sort of twin tubs and everything, and
but the idea of
housewives and
gadgetizing child rearing was still shocking. It was shocking, and he wrote an article about this box that he built for his daughter. It was a crib. It was sort of like the cross between a crib and a fish aquarium in a way. That you could see the child in the crib, but she was enclosed in this kind of glass container. And he wrote an article for Ladies' Home Journal, a popular mainstream women's magazine, explaining this idea of having a more scientific way of raising a child. And I think he was shocked. I think he was stunned that the feedback wasn't all positive. His archives were full of hate mail. I mean, people wrote to the local police saying that his child was in danger. People wrote and tried to get his professorship taken away from him a bit. I mean, I think that people were shocked. Of course,
They tried to cancel him.
They did try to cancel him. Yes, yes. But lots of people were also really fascinated by it as well. And I think that that's also part of it, is that he was this lightning rod, and everyone had a very passionate response to B.F. Skinner. You either thought he was absolutely, like I said, absolutely villainous and a danger to, the future of children, certainly, or you thought he was just absolutely a genius and would revolutionize the way in which we lived and worked and learned. Nobody's neutral on B.F. Skinner. Nobody is sort of like, I don't know. I don't really have an opinion on B.F. Skinner. Everybody has an opinion on B.F. Skinner.
The way we work has changed, and the way we learn is changing too. But 70% of organisations don't feel that their learning systems can really cope with all this change. It seems there is a disconnect between what learners need right now and what most learning suites provide. In a new white paper, Ben Betts and I tell the story of how this disconnect happened and lay out a vision for what a modern learning system ought to be and do. It's called Sweet Dreams, and you can read it now.
There's a theme here in the book of the drive to individualise education, or as we say, to personalise it. And that's there very early on from Pressey, I think, and very big in Skinner. So personalisation of learning has happened now in the organisational context big time. LXPs and so on have learning paths, and those could be reconfigured. We have all sorts of ways of personalising learning. Of course, personalisation is absolutely huge in the consumer space as well, but it hasn't happened in education, has it? Why do you think that is?
I think that, so when these education psychologists in the early 20th century first started talking about personalization, I think it was an interesting moment in education, because education in some ways, particularly at that moment in US history, and I should add here, my book is very much grounded in the history of US education. It's not to say that there weren't teaching machines elsewhere, but I do try to center it on what was happening in the US. Mm-hmm. And of course, the US had experienced a great deal of immigration, and education was really seen as the way to enculturate people into becoming an American. And in some ways, education was seen as how we would standardize you and turn you into a good citizen, if nothing else, certainly a good worker. And I think that there became concern in the 1920s from many quarters that perhaps all of that standardization wasn't a good thing, and that we needed to pay more attention to the individual and less attention into sort of the masses. Mm-hmm. And a lot of course, this came about at the same time as the rise of standardized testing. And I think even there you can kind of see the dilemma. We have these tests that everyone takes, and they're the same tests, so they're standardized. And yet, based on what happens from those standardized tests, you get different data about students. And with that data, you'll then be able to personalize their education. Mm-hmm. So standardization and personalization are really, a bit like I said earlier, automation and individual and personalization are tied up together. And early in the 1920s, people were certain if we could just get more data about students, not just sort of the tests that would tests that would know what students' achievement, what they understood, could get more data from aptitude tests. We could do intelligence testing, of course. We could do personality testing. We could sort of get all of this data. And then if teachers just had that data, then they would be able to do a better job of personalizing education. This was what people were saying in the 1920s. And this is, of course, absolutely what people are saying today. This is very much, I think, the still the fantasy of a lot of ed tech and tech entrepreneurs. I mean, you would hear Mark Zuckerberg, for example, talk about education this way. If we can just get more data, then we'll be able to personalize education more successfily. And I think that, so in some ways, I think we have, we have really gone down. We've spent the last 100 years gleaning a lot of data from students, and I think that there are ways in which things have become within that realm of standardization. There is some individualization, but I don't think it ever lives up to this sort of fantasy of personalization that many of these characters had. There was a one character in the book, Simon Ramo, who I found fascinating because he was also the guy who invented the intercontinental ballistic missile. Sort of like this great contributor to warfare and ed tech. But he wrote this fantasy. He had this really detailed fantasy about what would happen if he wrote this in the 1950s about what education would look like if every student sort of had this Instaplate that sort of contained all their data, and they could move through school, and some of their lessons would be videos, and all of their content would be personalized for them. And again, I think that all of this just seems so contemporary. I mean, the language is slightly different. We don't talk about, we don't imagine there being that kind of chunk of hardware that students must lug with them everywhere. But I think that this is still very much a fantasy. And why it hasn't happened, I mean, I think that there are probably lots of reasons, but some of it is that I think some of it is really just a fantasy that doesn't coincide with what we still want the institution of education to do, which is to standardize people. I mean, I think the institution really is about standardizing us. And I don't mean that just in a terrible way. I mean, there are shared cultural values, things that we think our children should all learn. And in groups of 25, there's a certain amount, practically speaking, there's a certain amount of standardization that happens. There's also a lot of individualization that happens that teachers do that I don't think gets noticed because it's not technical.
It occurs to me when I was reading the book, and it starts off, you give Sal Khan quite a hard time, and I felt some of that was perhaps slightly unjustified. Did the civil rights movement really have that much to do with what he was saying in terms of, I don't think he was saying that nothing has happened in education. It was structurally things haven't changed, and a lot of technologists point this out, that you have kind of anachronistic survivals like the long summer holiday, which was instituted so that the kids could go and help their families get the harvest in sort of pre-industrial times and so on, and that's still there. But one thing I felt that's really justified about what you said in terms of the way technologists get it wrong time and again when they attempt to improve education is exactly what you were saying there, that there are all sorts of bits that what's going on in education that just don't come into it. There's the kind of cultural cohesion thing. In the English public schools, this was always talked about as character building, and schools have various ways of finessing the same thing and using different language, but it's felt that schools are there to kind of build character for life. You have sport, massively important in certain areas of English education and certainly in American education, and there's also childcare, which came up in the in the lockdowns we had. It turned out that the economy can't function if the schools close, because so much of what schools do now that couples tend to have two jobs, they have to be able to afford to live. Close down the schools, someone's going to look after those kids. Suddenly the economy grinds to a halt, apart from anything else because of that. And it seems, sorry, this is rather a long-winded question, but it seems to me that one of the things technologists get badly wrong is that they kind of push all that other stuff that schools and education do to the side and say, let's just focus on it as a matter of kind of content delivery and testing.
So one thing I would add to that, and I think that we certainly, I would say both the UK and the US have experienced this in the last at least 4 to 5 years, is I think this sort of disillusion of a lot of that cohesion. And it's interesting that a lot of that has coincided with this rise of a lot of tech that sort of touted its personalization, right? So like social media. So the idea that because you can get a very personalized view of the world through your Facebook feed or through your YouTube algorithms, that you're 2 clicks, you're watching a video on how to make scrambled eggs, and you're 3 clicks away from being from Nazi indoctrination videos. And so I think that and I think that that's in some ways that's personalized learning. That really is an algorithm deciding, well, your interests seem to be this, we're going to take you down a certain pathway. And so it seems to me that because of I think of this real real struggles that the US has experienced, they're not new struggles, but I think they've really sort of blossomed in the last few years. I think in some ways personalization seems even more dangerous because I think what we need to recognize are these shared community values, shared values, cohesion, responsibility for the group, and not just a reliance on the individual. And I think that that's one of the things that the teaching machine, whether the teaching machine of the 50s or the teaching machines today, the stuff that students do today, these are very isolated experience. These are very isolating. You are alone with the program. And I think that means that you miss out on a lot of the opportunities for debate, discussion, dialogue, and a shared experiences of learning. When I hear people who tell anecdotes about how they wished that education was more personalized, they talk about ways in which they moved too quickly in class and they were bored, or they struggled and they felt left behind. But often you don't hear stories about ways in which people really learned a lot from other people. Those aren't part of the narrative. The ways in which you had an aha moment, not because something happened to you, but because someone else experienced something in a lesson. Someone else said something in a lesson. A teacher made a comment to another student, and it was instructive and helpful for you. And I think by prioritizing only the individual, you end up with Trump's America, sadly.
Implicit in Skinner's idea of teaching machines is that there is only one thing to teach. There is the truth, whether it's from Skinner or whoever. And all those questions are either right or wrong. Well, that's okay with maths. And time and again, technologists begin things by saying, okay, here's a model that's going to work great for maths. You try to move that to other things like the teaching of history. Is it possible to teach history without there being alternative opinions, alternative facts in some cases? And also the teachers saying themselves, it's not only the pupils learn from each other, sometimes the teachers learn from what happens in class. Let's hope they do.
Absolutely.
So there's a kind of flawed model there. And the thing it most reminds me of is organizational e-learning in the years 2000 to 2010, before people, the pushback really came in against the model of kind of LMS and e-learning courses. where what you had in essence was a very Skinnerite model of content delivery with marks that goes into the LMS. It all kind of looks very neat and tidy until you realize that it's got absolutely nothing to do with instructional design.
Yes, I mean, I think that's the part of it that I think is such a powerful legacy of behaviorism and Skinner that I think sort of gets brushed aside. That we tell this story in education technology that Skinner was defeated. Like, we got rid of Skinner. We're beyond behaviorism. Cognitive science came along and it supplanted behaviorism. Nobody does behaviorism any longer, and so we don't have to worry about that oppressive, mechanistic, reductivist ideas any longer. We're better than that. But I think that that's not true. And I think that if you look at so much technology and so much ed tech, and even a lot of practices that aren't technological, you still see behaviorism is so powerful. The influence of Skinner is still there today. I don't know that people necessarily recognize that legacy. I think that that's part of this amnesia, in particular, that technologists have, or this, it's not even an amnesia, this refusal to recognize the past. But you look at the rise of a lot of even these terms that folks in Silicon Valley use, like the nudge, a lot of the ways in which things are gamified, for example, that all really draws on the kinds of rewards and things that Skinner really was interested in. And I think that even cognitive science, I think, is built on a lot of the ideas of behaviorism. I think, unlike Skinner, they're willing to talk about the mind, in which Skinner only said we could talk about behaviors. Yeah. But I think that we really are still so beholden to behaviorism. And I should say, like many people over the pandemic, we adopted a puppy. We got a new dog, and that required, of course, a lot of training. And of course, the way in which you train a dog is behaviorism. It's through positive reinforcement. And so here I was, sort of working on the final ideas of the book, spending my time, deeply immersed in, practically speaking, in sort of this sort of behaviorist practices and behaviorist technologies. We try to, a clicker to get the dog to associate certain things.
The clicker, use that. Yeah.
Skinner had an article that he wrote, I think, in the for Scientific American, helping people to train their dogs in the 1950s. And so, it was funny for me to be reminded. And it's not just dogs that we treat that way. If it were dogs, I would feel a little less concerned politically about it. But I think that, I do think that behaviorism, it still governs so much of what we do. And I do think that what that means is that our technologies, so many of our education technologies, really are about control. They really are not about the things that we think we're talking about when we talk about something like personalization. Personalization sounds so liberatory, right? It sounds so deeply personally fulfilling. And I don't think that that's actually what the machinery does. It's actually much more standardized, much more controlling, engineered, and not towards liberation. Skinner would say no such thing anyway.
What's been your own personal journey in learning? In essence, what led you to the point where this book was the one you wanted to write?
I love this question, and it's actually, it's always I get it a lot as someone who writes about education. People ask me sort of what was my educational experience, and I have such a long and convoluted educational story that I think perhaps that's why I have a long and convoluted book about ed tech. I don't know. My dad was from Wyoming. My mom is from England. And so I was raised sort of in a split, sort of split between a very small town, rural setting. And then we would very often go back to England to see my mom's family. And when I was in 4th and 5th grade, so 9 or 10, I went and stayed with my aunt and went to school in England, and then was more formally sent away to school in England when I was 16 and 17 to boarding school there. And, I dropped out of college. I've dropped out of a PhD program. I've taught online. I taught college for many years. So I've experienced lots of different versions and modes and places of education. And I think one of the things that it's always taught me is that there are so many different systems and practices and beliefs around education. And anytime I hear someone say it's always like this, or it's always been like this, I'm suspicious, because my own experiences within my lifetime have shown that education is very varied depending on where you are, who you are. And so it's the thing that's, I think, made me really interested in learning, how did we get to this point where education looks like this? How did we get to this point where education technology looks the way it does? Why does it suck so bad? Why does the learning management system, right? Why is it so terrible? And so I think that's, I think having a lot of different experiences in different places with education has sort of always made me really interested in how we got here, which was what led to this book.
And finally, when is the book released?
August 3rd.
August 3rd.
Yeah.
Okay. And how can people best follow your work and thought, apart from buying the book, which is, it's a good read. I really recommend it.
So, if you'd asked me a year ago, I would have had a different answer. I would have said, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Audrey Watters on Twitter. But I actually decided one of my New Year's resolutions was to take a break from social media. And it's been amazing. And I have this contractual obligation to promote the book in the coming months. And I will resurface on Twitter to share links and when people write reviews of the book, etc. But I don't know that social media is the place to look for me. But I am a writer. And so you will find my work on my website, audreywatters.com. I have a website that focuses on education technology called hackeducation.com. And I would say look for me on the web, but don't look for me on social media.
Okay. So there's a good Google search term for you, hack education, almost as good as the learning hack.
Very similar.
We're in the same SEO space.
Right.
And I think we're in the same space in many other things as well. I really enjoyed your book, and I've enjoyed talking to you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for taking the time.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Audrey and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. Please subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
We're off on our holes now, but we'll come roaring back in September with a whole new pack of wildly interesting guests and a new sister podcast, Great Minds on Learning. Bye for now.
In the meantime, we'll be featuring some of the best liked episodes from past seasons. So until we return in person, stay classy, stay curious, and above all, stay safe, learning people.
Have a great summer.
Now I finally get it.
And a photo of your dog, so drop that in. But I was really interested by that you have a hard day working on the book, and then you go and do a bit of operant conditioning with the dog.
Yeah, I know. Oh, I know.